Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Michael Noland here, and tonight we're going to discuss Led Zeppelin's other secret weapon. Now some of you may be asking yourselves, I didn't even know Led Zeppelin had a secret weapon, let alone another secret weapon. But for those of you who have seen my other videos on Led Zeppelin, you know that I've already identified Led Zeppelin's primary secret weapon, a weapon that only one other band in the history of rock had and regularly utilized. Alright, so what do I mean by Led Zeppelin's other secret weapon? First of all, let's identify Led Zeppelin's first secret weapon. You know, if you just take a look at the members of Led Zeppelin and what they had to offer just on a superficial level right off the bat on their first album, they had rock and roll's very best guitarist, best drummer, and best vocalist, along with rock's very best bassist. That membership alone guaranteed this band some sort of success. But you know, out of that membership, there was a key member that served as what I consider Led Zeppelin's secret weapon. Of course, that was John Paul Jones, their bassist. You see, he was a multi-instrumentalist. He was a composer as well. And as Led Zeppelin evolved, John Paul Jones' talents were key to their success. His whole musical background, similar to Jimmy Page in that he and Jimmy were hardened studio professionals in great demand. But of the two, the classically trained musician was John Paul Jones. Now think about this. There is only one other band in history that I can think of that had a utility player on the level of John Paul Jones. And that, of course, were the Beatles. Their bassist, Paul McCartney, wasn't just a bassist. He played piano. He was a great drummer. And when pushed to the wall, he could play absolutely blazing lead guitar. Some of Paul McCartney's lead guitar playing on Beatle tracks are some of rock and roll's very best lead guitar solos. Now, as I've stated before, only these two bands rose to such a level that they would command an entire decade. The Beatles with the 60s, Led Zeppelin coming out in the late 60s, but really taking hold by the 70s and absolutely commandeering the next decade. And I don't think it's any accident that both of these bands were blessed with at least one key member who could fill so many needed spaces when called upon. Alright, so with all of that in mind, what do I mean when I say Led Zeppelin's other secret weapon? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that is the subject of tonight's video. Was there a fifth member of Led Zeppelin? And you know what? I think there was. But in this case, I'm not talking about a person taking up that fifth member position. I'm talking about a place. Actually, I'm talking about a couple of places. First of all, I'm talking about Headley Grange, and second, the cabin, Bron-Yr-Aur. Now I know that's not the old pronunciation. I once knew it and I've long since forgotten it. So for tonight's video, we'll just call the cabin Bron-Yr-Aur. Now why in the hell would I consider two places, a cabin and a large house, as a fifth member to this band? Well, first of all, for those of you who are not familiar with these two locations, Bron-Yr-Aur was the cabin that Jimmy Page and Robert Plant for a period of time lived at together while they wrote songs for Led Zeppelin. And of course, Headley Grange was not only a place where they wrote material, but it was a place where they actually recorded for their albums. That's right, a lot of what you've heard from Led Zeppelin was recorded in a house. Now we'll talk about Headley Grange and exactly why it was such an important location for Led Zeppelin in a minute. But first, let's turn our attention to Bron-Yr-Aur. Now I talked about how Jimmy Page, although absolutely committed to having Robert Plant in the band, he knew Robert Plant could handle the vocals, and by the end of their first tour, he knew he could perform. But the question was still up for grabs. Could he take on lyric writing for for the band. Now, Jimmy Page wasn't just the leader and progenitor of Led Zeppelin. He was also their producer. You know, the producer in his head told him somebody was going to have to step up and take on that responsibility. And there was no clear, concise direction that Jimmy had in mind. He knew that if Robert could write lyrics, that would take a lot of the stress off Jimmy. Newly impressed by how much Robert had already stepped up to the plate, Jimmy rented out the cottage, Bron-Yr-Aur, just so that him and Robert could spend a specific period of time to do nothing but to get to know each other and to see if they might be able to come up with some new material for Led Zeppelin. In other words, write songs together. Now, over the years, in interviews, Jimmy has often reminisced how him and Robert would go out and take walks together, be discussing something. Robert would say something, Jimmy would stop immediately, either grabbing his guitar to work out an idea that Robert had possibly vocalized just a moment before, writing down these ideas so that he wouldn't forget them, what they both came up with on these walks and during their stay at Bron-Yr-Aur. Now, in future videos, we'll discuss what was written where and when and how and why. But for tonight, let's just say a lot of Led Zeppelin's material were written at these two locations. Encouraged by Robert and his results from Bron-Yr-Aur, Jimmy would later encourage the band to not only live, but record and write at Headley Grange. Now, Headley Grange, if you count the cellar, was a 4-story monster of a house. And if you've seen the film, It Might Get Loud, there we see Jimmy Page paying a visit to Headley Grange as it looks today. Back when Led Zeppelin used and recorded at Headley Grange, the place was in a bit of disrepair. It was often cold as hell, and the band always had the fireplace running 24 hours a day. Now, Jimmy encouraged the band to do this so that they could eat, sleep, and write and record Led Zeppelin. So what you have is this extremely large, cold house. The band is sequestered from their families. They're expected to participate in the writing and recording, as well as the playing of any musical ideas that would develop. Now, right away, Jimmy Page was impressed with the acoustics of the place. They tried at first to place Bonzo's drum set in a more traditional place in the house that would give more traditional drum sounds. But after Bonzo bought a brand new drum set and had it delivered, his drum tech set it up in the entrance foyer of the house. Both Jimmy and Bonzo immediately noticed the drums sounded fantastic in that room. The acoustics were perfect. But in order to get the sound of those acoustics on record, Jimmy and his engineer immediately started to experiment with mic placing. Instead of shoving those microphones right up against the drums, as was the wont in those days, they would bring the microphones further back from the drums in order to catch the natural ambiance of the room, as well, of course, as any reverb to the room. Now, it's interesting, when you think about when Led Zeppelin started using these two locations, it started with the recording of their third album. Now, that there is interesting. Think about this. Basically, Led Zeppelin had 8 albums that they produced while all 4 members were alive. So out of those 8 albums, recordings were done at Headley Grange for 4 of those albums. Now, the 4 Led Zeppelin albums that benefited from this approach were, of course, Led Zeppelin 3, Led Zeppelin 4, or Zozo if you prefer, Houses of the Holy, and Physical Graffiti. Now compare those 4 albums to the remaining 4 albums. You have Led Zeppelin's first album, Led Zeppelin 2, Presence, and In Through the Outdoor. Whenever they recorded at Headley, you always had a much more organic sound to their records. As a matter of fact, although it had been hinted at on Led Zeppelin's first 2 albums, it's with Led Zeppelin 3 that we see the band fully embrace the lighter side of Jimmy's vision. But is it the fact that both these places were highly conducive to good songwriting, and one of them even winding up being quite the recording facility all on its own. Well, with the aid of the Rolling Stones' mobile recording studio anyway. No, you see, I think there was another important factor here, and it has to do with Robert Plant's writing. You see, Robert was always interested in Old English poetry, Celtic and English mythology, and the fact that these facilities were older buildings. It just lent a certain atmosphere. Now, like I said, I want to do an entire video where we get into the writing that occurred at these two locations. But one good example is Robert Plant writing Stairway to Heaven in a single sitting at Headley Grange, where he let what he felt was the energy of the surrounding countryside and the energy of that house influence his writing. And of course, with Jimmy claiming that he had seen a spectral figure there, he thought the place was haunted. Who knows what else Headley Grange had to offer. But you know, ghosts or no ghosts, is it possible for a structure to take on a personality? Well, think back to your own lives, a childhood home that you've long moved away from. You go back to it. Perhaps the new owners invite you in, and it doesn't quite seem the same. Can you even begin to imagine the power that a place like Headley Grange and Bron-Yr-Aur would have on very artistically sensitive musicians? And with Jimmy encouraging the band to spend some time there, to live together as a group, they had time to absorb everything that place had to offer. Just listen to the 4 albums that were either fully recorded there or partially recorded at those places and compare them to the other 4 albums. I think most Led Zeppelin fans would agree that Led Zeppelin's so-called growth albums were the albums that were recorded and written, especially at Headley Grange.